You are listening to Meet the Thriller Author, the podcast where I interview writers of mysteries, thrillers, and suspense books. I am your host, Alan Peterson, and this is episode number 171. In this episode of the podcast, we'll be meeting Rory Clements, who is a British author of historical thrillers. He won the CWA Ellis Peters Historical Award in 2010 for his novel Revenger, and the CWA Historical Dagger in 2018 for Nucleus. His latest novel, A Prince and a Spy, was published on September 7th. It's his first novel to be published here in America, but it's the fifth book in his Tom Wilde series. Rory lives in Dover, England, and I had a great chat with Rory about the amount of research he puts into his historical thrillers, how he balances incorporating real historical characters like Winston Churchill and Prince George into a work of fiction, and a whole lot more. So check out that interview coming up here in just a moment. But before we get to it, I want to let you know about this episode's sponsor, which is Masterclass. If you're not familiar, Masterclass is a streaming platform that makes it possible for anyone to learn from the very best. It's accessible on your phone, web, Apple TV, Roku devices, Amazon Fire TV. I like to watch the courses on my Samsung Smart TV in that crisp 4K HD, and also on my phone whenever I'm out and about and I have some downtime. They're really fantastic. And for fans of thrillers, readers, and especially for you aspiring thriller writers out there, and the experienced ones too, check out the classes from Dan Brown, James Patterson, David Baldacci, and Walter Mosley. They're fantastic. So you can check it out at thrillingreads.com/masterclass. All right, here is my interview with Rory Clements. Welcome to the podcast, Rory.
Thank you very much, Alan.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background, please?
My background, I was in newspapers for quite a while, national newspapers in Great Britain, in London. But I was always writing in my spare time, not getting anywhere with it. But then, we left London. We came up to the wilds of Norfolk, not Norfolk, Virginia, Norfolk in England. And we had two young kids and we wanted them to school outside the city. I had to earn a living and I got down to the writing seriously. And it's a very different thing when you write full time to when you write in your spare time while doing another full-time job. And I was very lucky. I took off immediately. I managed to get an agent very quickly and got a publisher very quickly. And the last 12, 14 years, I've made a decent enough living writing thrillers. The first, a series of Tudor thrillers set in later Elizabethan times. More recently, I've turned my hand to the 1930s and 1940s with a hero called Tom Wilde, who's a history professor at Cambridge University in England, and he happens to be American.
And did you always were you interested in historical thrillers? Is that why when you were trying to figure out what to write? Is that why you chose to write the historical type thrillers?
I've always been interested in thrillers, particularly. I mean, not just historical thrillers, all thrillers. I just love thrillers. I just go back to Ian Fleming and William Goldman and all the great thriller writers. I just think that it's the way to go. I guess you feel much the same as you run this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So ever since I was a little kid, but I always loved the thrillers.
Yeah, me too.
And so I was kind of curious. So now Prince and the Spy is actually the fifth book in the Tom Wilde series, but it's the first book that's being published here in the States, in America.
It is, yeah. And I'm delighted with that. Yeah, I think it has a very strong American element. One thing, I mean, because the prince involved was Duke of Kent, Prince George, who was the king's brother, and he died in a plane crash in 1942 in the middle of the war. Now he was really good friends with Roosevelt, and in fact, he just had a son a couple of months before he died, and Roosevelt was godfather to the child, who's still alive today. His name is Prince Michael of Kent.
Before we get into the details of the book, I was kind of curious about your impressions with the publishing business in the UK compared to America, to the States. Is it the same, similar, different?
Well, I'd be very pleased with the way my American publishers, Pegasus, have been working. I must say, I think they've done a fantastic looking cover. It's very different to the British cover. I mean, I like the British cover very much, and I also very much like the very different tack that the Pegasus have taken. Yeah, they seem very proactive. I think I'm very pleased with them.
Yeah, they sent me an advanced copy, and so I've been enjoying reading this. And yeah, the covers is very nice. And I remember I did look at your website when I was preparing for this and noticed that it was that your other books have different covers in the UK. And I remember Michael Connolly always has different books. It's kind of interesting that even though it's the same book, but they use different covers depending on the countries. I didn't realize that was something that the publishers did, but it's fascinating to see that part of the business.
I mean, I guess they know their market.
Yeah, they're the experts,
job.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit then about how did this the Wild series start? Can you give us tell us about that process?
Well, as I said, I'd written seven of my Tudor thrillers, and you need a break sometimes, and I might go back to those one day, but I really love doing that. And I was just chatting one day with my agent and my editor, and they both thought it wouldn't be a bad idea for me to have a go at something else. And I'd always had the back of my mind that I'd really like to do a thriller series set around the World War II, and they went for it. And I was lucky; it took off, and I won an award for it, and been in the top 10 of the Sunday Times. Very pleased with it.
Yes, it's a fascinating time too. The whole World War II and like your book has the OSS and the intelligence service in the UK. It's so fascinating.
Well, it was very important, of course, the OSS in the UK, and by in 1942, it was just beginning. But by the end of the war, I mean, the whole place in Grosvenor Street was absolutely packed out with great people, men and women. They did great work. They infiltrated deep into the heart of Europe, and there's some very, very impressive people among them. And some people say, why is my hero an American? There was a very specific reason for that. He's a history professor at Cambridge University. Now, the Cambridge University at that time is a bit different to the way it is now. One thing, there were no women; it was all boys. There were a couple of women's colleges, but they were separate. They didn't even get degrees. But they were also all from the upper middle classes, private schools, and they just sort of got their places there, grace and favor. I wanted somebody who was an outsider who'd look at that sort of, that Brideshead Revisited world with a sort of a wry eye. Somebody who was sort of, just think some of it was a bit amusing, maybe. So an American seemed to be an outsider. And, I had a couple of famous American intelligence people in mind who had strong links with Britain in mind when I came up with my protagonist, Tom Wilde.
Yeah, it's so fascinating too because so much of the U.S. like the CIA and they learned that came the OSS was its predecessor, and they learned that from the British intelligence, and our Delta Force and Green Berets all was up from the SAS over there in the UK. So a lot of the stuff that we have here, we learned it from you guys.
Well, I think they had to at the first place. I mean, the OSS, when they started off, were actually trained by the British Secret Services, but they very, very quickly came up and, got their act together and made their own way in the world. They were remarkable people.
Yeah, and I don't want to give out any spoilers or anything here, but can you discuss a little bit about because there's a theory on this book on a theory that the Prince George was murdered in that plane crash. Was that something that came up from your story, or is that a conspiracy theory that's been around for a while?
There have been many conspiracy theories about the death of Prince George over the years. Some of them a bit silly, one involving the idea that if Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, was a passenger on the plane, and then he was replaced with a dummy to go to the Nuremberg trials later. I mean, that sounds preposterous to me. But at the same time, there was something very, very strange about the plane crash. It was I've been up there, and it's not a high mountain. It crashed into a hill about 600 feet high, and it had plenty of time to gain height. This plane, it had left Invergordon Air Base, supposedly en route to Iceland. It had been in play about half an hour, in the air about half an hour. It had plenty of time to gain 10,000 feet probably, and there was actually nothing wrong with the plane. The engines were perfectly working order. There were top pilots on board. Prince George himself was a pilot. Why did it crash into this hillside? Very little was made of the whole event at the time. That was said to be because the British royal family didn't want anyone in Britain to think that their loss was any greater than anyone else's. And of course, this is at a time when Britain was being bombed and fighting and people being killed in the war. And I can understand that. But at the same time, I couldn't understand why the plane crashed. Why were these important people just on this supposedly innocuous trip to Iceland to visit the troops? There are things that don't add up. And I came up with a theory which I thought was feasible, of what they were really doing. And I won't give it away, but I think it works as what really happened.
And so is that how it works when you're coming up with the idea for your books? You take like something that really happened, and then you go off from there? I'm kind of curious about your system. Do you outline these? Do you spend a lot of time researching this before you start writing them?
I do a lot of research, but it's a very good question about real events. Yes, I do look at real events, and I look at them with I look at it with my newspaper man's eye. After many years in newspapers, I have a good eye for a story, and I also have a good eye for what might really have happened. I'm always thinking, what's really going on there behind the scenes, because very often things aren't what they seem to be on the surface. And yeah, that's what I do. They're very much what if books, secret histories. They are. I'm not doing a complete counterfactual story like if the Nazis, a story where the Nazis won the war and took over, like the man in the High Tower. I'm not doing that sort of thing. I'm saying this thing could have happened and be part of history, but we just haven't discovered it yet. Do you understand the difference?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So that's just more like, what do you call it? The speculative versus this is more grounded on the actual history of the era.
Actual history. I'm not changing history.
Yeah.
I'm saying, what if this happened? And yeah.
Yeah, and I enjoy that more as a reader than even like the movies like that the Hightower one, or that Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards. They're fun to watch, but it's just so weird. It's like, well, that didn't really happen. It's like,
what did you think about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? Have you seen that yet?
Yeah, I did. I was surprised when that happened. I shouldn't have been, but I didn't see it going that way. And then it was just like, what is going on?
I have to say, I always enjoy his films. So.
Oh, I do too. He's one of my favorites. But yeah, that was kind of crazy. I'm like, oh, so he's doing an Inglourious Bastards here on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Yeah. So yeah, well, I guess it's fun to get your revenge. To mow down Hitler in the movie theater like you did in that movie.
Exactly.
So for the listeners who aren't familiar with your books, can you just tell us like what can they expect when they're reading one of your novels?
Crikey, that is a really difficult question. Hopefully they are an easy read.
Mm-hmm.
well-researched read. I hope you won't find many errors of history in there. You will meet people who are real people, and you'll meet people who are fictional, and hopefully they'll all work together. And hopefully, I always try and get a really good ending to my books. I'm not one of those. I get so annoyed if I'm watching a TV series, like an 8-part TV series, and I get to the end of it and it's a disappointing ending. I think, did I really waste 8 hours of my life on that story? So I want to make sure that any readers of my book, they will really be thrilled by the end of it, because I've worked it out beforehand. I know where I'm going. I'm not just leaving it to the last minute to see what happens. Anyway.
Yeah,
that's for other people to decide whether I make it work or not. But that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. And then I was also wondering too, because like you mentioned, you have like historical figures in there, like FDR, and fictional. Is that how's that balancing that when you're writing that? Is that you don't worry about that, or do you worry that you're?
I don't worry about that.
Yeah.
Historical fiction goes back to Shakespeare. It probably goes a bit before that. It probably goes back to the Odyssey and the Iliad. Shakespeare, when he had his Henry V, there are real people in there, and they're invented people. And he invented all the language. People didn't say all those things in Shakespeare's history plays. Don't get me wrong. I'm not comparing myself to Shakespeare. I'm just talking about what historical fiction does. It takes real events, and it gives. Often historical events are skeletons, and you're adding flesh to them. You're trying to say, this is what could have happened. You're not pretending to be a historian saying this did happen. You're saying this is what could have happened, and making sense of sometimes very sketchy historical events.
And so this is the 5th book in the series. How's that going? Are you are going to be any more books in the series coming out?
I've got one finished. It's at the editing stage now. It should hopefully be coming out in England in January. I hope Pegasus pick it up and bring it out. We'll have to see. That's up to them. But I'm very pleased with the next one, and I'm very pleased with this one, actually. I think this is certainly the best I've done. I'm really thrilled with it when I finished it. I thought it was quite a, if you know the, if you read it, Alan, you'll see there is also the early indications of the Holocaust in there, which was inspired by the attempts by a couple of real life characters who don't appear in the book, but they in 1942 were trying to get out word of the Holocaust. They saw it happening, the death camps in Poland, long before the rest of the world knew about it. And so, to me, that's an important element of the story.
Yeah, I find that fascinating when I was reading it too. I actually Googled. I'm like, is that really a real person? And yeah, sure enough, the Mueller, I believe that was his name. So it's just fascinating how you tied everything in like that together into a story that it's pretty big topics, of course, some pretty dark subject matters, but it was an entertaining read. I've always been a fan of spy thrillers, so I think even if someone just enjoys a good spy thriller, they're going to enjoy this book. So that was so that was definitely a fun. So I was also curious now with your writing process, because I always ask this because I have aspiring writers that are listening to this podcast. So what are the tools of your trade? Do you use just Word or some other type of software program? Or
I work on an Apple, so I use Pages.
Oh, okay, yeah, Pages.
And I work very unsociable hours. I work very late at night. I work from about midnight to about 3 or 4 in the morning. I set myself 1,000 words a day, and that's why I work so late, because it comes to midnight and I haven't done my work. So I just stay there and I stay there and I stay there until it's finished. And I sort of now got into this bad habit of staying up really, really late into the night. And then I get up about 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. I go through what I've done, have some breakfast and coffee. And then hopefully in the afternoon, I play tennis. Try and do that 2 or 3, maybe 4 times a week. In fact, after I've talked to you now, I'm intending to go out this evening for a game. I'm a bit of an addict for tennis. And I also watch it a lot as well, which can interfere with my work late at night, especially when something like the North American events are on, like Cincinnati at the moment, and Flushing Meadows coming up soon.
Yeah, like the time difference. So yeah, that's going to interfere with your work hours. I was going to say, so
it coincides with my work hours.
yeah. I was going to say, so what time is it over there now? Like 6 o'clock or so?
It's 6 o'clock. Yeah. 6:20.
Yeah. So your writing day hasn't even started yet.
It hasn't started yet. Well, yeah, but my editing day started. I go through what I've done, and I do a lot of reading because there is a massive amount of research in the books I write, and there will be people to pick me up when I get things wrong. I once or twice I've had problems with weaponry because I don't have guns, and once I think I had a Smith and Wesson ejecting a cartridge. And I was told later that particular model did not eject a cartridge. Well, I'm sorry about that. And I fixed it for the paperback, but that was in the hardback.
Well, yeah. Well, especially you're not only dealing with you're dealing with older weaponry too, which is kind of makes it a little even harder to, even if you could get a hold of it, it'd be kind of hard to get a hold of, I think, of a 1940s or 30s revolver or pistol.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so as a night owl, I really like that hearing that about your hours. I will say, because almost everybody I interview, they always say like, "Oh, I wake up at 5 a.m." So you're just going to bed at 5 a.m. I like that.
Yeah. Are you a night owl as well?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Yeah. It's quite nice. It's quite nice, sort of wandering out to bed and finding that it's actually daylight. And just going to bed, isn't it?
Yeah. It's everything is quiet and there's less distractions. And
it is. There are the phones don't ring. There's nothing to disturb you.
Yeah. So I was also wondering too, with this crazy year that just keeps on giving, this pandemic year plus now, how did that affect at all your writing process or
I've been very lucky. We live in the countryside in an old farmhouse, and there are lots of fantastic walks around here. I mean, the only difference it made to me was that I couldn't see people I wanted to see, and I couldn't play tennis. I don't know why they banned tennis, but they banned tennis. So I went for a 5-mile walk every day and carried on my work. And yeah, it's now seems to be opening up in England. I don't know how it is in America, but it's opening up here. Funnily enough, my daughter, who's 20, she's just got COVID, but she seems to be doing pretty well with it. She's in London in her apartment. So I haven't actually seen her. Well, you see her on FaceTime. Mm-hmm. But, she seems all right.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. The young. It seems like it's affecting the younger people now. This new variant or whatever. But hopefully, since they're younger, it doesn't hit them as hard. So
it doesn't seem to so much, does it?
Yeah. So that's a positive outlet, I guess. I don't know, the way it's going. It looks like everyone's going to be getting some sort of variation of it. So who knows?
I guess they will. Yeah. I mean, we'll all end up either jabbed or have had it. I guess they should be swimming with antibodies.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So you're aspiring. This is the one question I always ask before I wrap things up. Again, for the aspiring writers, any advice out there, especially if they're interested in perhaps writing a historical thriller like you do?
The obvious thing is you have to do your research. Mm-hmm. You have to do your research to the extent that you don't have to think about what's happening. You have to feel that you're there in that time. You have to be so immersed in the time that you don't. Otherwise, you have to have far more research than you actually need. So you can discard a lot of the research. You're not trying to fill it in. It should just feel natural. That's what I'm saying. Obviously, you have a problem with getting the right voice, as publishers always call it, for your period. Now, if you're writing about the 16th century like I did, you have to talk in a language that doesn't seem quaint, as and Shakespearean, because your readers would get lost. And also, those people were not quaint. The people there were tough people who went around the world in ships that were just basically wooden tubs. And then again, for the 20th century, their language is very familiar in the 1930s, but actually they also talked in very different ways to the way we did. And not just in this country, in Britain, but in America too, I'm sure the same is true, that there was casual racism and there was casual sexism, which it was familiar then, but it would be wrong to have it now. When I remember sort of my grandparents talking, the way they talked, it was appalling, actually, some of the time. But it was just what they were brought up with, I suppose. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yep, especially the last 5-10 years. No, not even the 5-10 years. The last 2 to 5 years, the changes have been monumental from when I was growing up. But
at the same time, you can't avoid the fact that they were like that in those times. I mean, because if you're dealing with Nazis, I mean, they weren't just casually racist. I mean, they were. It was a state-run necessity for them that that people had to go along with it, or they were done for. So you have to sort of accept the way people existed then and spoke, but you have to write it for a modern audience and respect the modern audience, and actually the modern audience is right and they were wrong, to tell the truth.
Yeah, that is fascinating. That's interesting. I never thought about that. That is a very difficult balance for you or for historical writers. I mean, yeah, you want to be true to the era, but you also don't want to offend everybody that's reading it in now in the 21st century.
Yeah. No, they were wrong in that time. In fact, I used to, I would have, I was brought up at a time when Britain still had the vestiges of an empire, and I used to have long arguments with my mother about it, because she sort of came from that empire background. She'd born out in Malaya. Her mother was born in India as part of the empire. And I had long arguments with my mother about how awful the empire actually was. But to them, they thought it was the greatest thing in the world.
So where can the listeners find you online on your website? I was checking out your website. You have a great looking website.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you to say so.
Yeah. And what was it's Rory, just your name, roryclements.co.uk.
roryclements.co.uk. Yep.
Yeah. So you can find information there. And Rory, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you for listening to Meet the Thriller Author. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with one of your favorite writers of mysteries and thrillers. Or if this episode's guest is new to you, I hope you give their books a chance. Helping listeners discover new authors and books is one of the coolest outcomes of doing this podcast. As always, you can head over to thrillerauthors.com to sign up to my Thrilling Reads email list. That way you won't miss out on any great deals in thriller and mystery books. You can also check out all the links and resources in the show notes for this episode over at thrillerauthors.com. And also please do subscribe to this podcast if you haven't done so already, and leave a rating and review wherever it is that you're listening to this show. If you have done that already, I thank you. I really do appreciate your support. For my other links to my author website, social media haunts, and more, check out thrillingreads.com/links. All my links will be on that page. So that's it for this episode. See you next time, and stay safe out there.